With that introduction, I have to smile even if I'm jet lagged. Thank you. What a joy it's been to be here. I want to speak about this idea of designing for heart intelligence, especially in a world subsumed and increasingly so by artificial intelligence. I was at a retreat earlier this year. We were in fact hosting it with all these global leaders in India at the Gandhi Ashram. And one of my greatest aha moments actually came from a teenager. And this teenager got into a debate at college with this friend, and this friend is saying, well, you're wrapping this gift, but why do you spend so much time wrapping a gift when the real value is what's inside? And she says, I didn't know how to respond to it, but I think that's a very interesting question because it forces us to differentiate between content and context. So much of what we do has been reduced down to content. And content, I mean, a simple way to understand it is if I have gone swimming out in the ocean and I give you a talk on swimming, it's going to resonate in a very different way than if I've just read some theory books and I'm talking about swimming. Like, we all intuitively understand this. But in an AI kind of a world, we are increasingly turning this multidimensional context into very singular content-driven transactional interactions. And this ends up being quite problematic. You might recognize this guy on your left. This is Joe Rogan, one of the most popular podcasters in the world. He was recently interviewing the guy on your right, whom you might also recognize, Steve Jobs. Except that Steve Jobs passed away a few years ago. So they put all his content into an AI, and they interviewed him. Which, of course, is like, oh, where does that go, right? But what was even telling is, this is Eric Schmidt, longtime president of Google. He heard this interview, and he says he teared up. And the reason why he teared up is he says, I knew Steve for 30 years. And this is exactly the kind of responses he would give to modern day questions. But he teared up he says, 10 years ago, I think I was a techno-optimist, and now I'm not so sure. So there's a long list of reasons, I'm not going to get into those, about the kind of threats that AI poses. But I want to focus on one particular thing. One is with the previous generation, I guess maybe 10 years ago, what social media did, and we saw this, is that it hacked our attention. But what AI promises to do is hack our intimacy. Right? And this is going at such an alarming rate. It took TV 75 years to get to 100 million users. Right? It took Netflix 3 years to do that. It took ChatGPT 2 months to do that. It took Facebook Threads 5 days to do that. So this is all changing so fast that before we can even figure out what questions to ask, the next challenge is upon us. And I think we might be better off thinking of AI as artificial intimacy, right? If you really think about it. But when you look at this whole context, right, and the many, many challenges it poses, the deeper underlying question is, well, are there opportunities? Challenges we know about. And I think the reason why it feels scary for most of us is because we have been identified with our content. Our egos, our identities are defined by the gifts we offer to the world, not by the wrapping. And as a result, what we see now as the cost of content goes to zero, no matter what we are producing in the world, what it does is also the flip, and I think therein lies the opportunity, especially for people like us who care for the inner, which is the value of context rises exponentially. Right? Cost of knowledge, it goes down, but context value goes up dramatically. Another way to understand this in a very simple way is this farmer, a Japanese farmer named Fukuoka. He's known as the grandfather of permaculture. Now you go to his farm, and he has a very interesting farm. So you don't do any pesticides or fertilizers, but you also don't till the soil, you don't do any pruning, and you don't do any weeding. You don't take out the weeds. So you're like, what kind of a farmer is that? He says, I call it do-nothing farming. But people from all over the world would go to Fukuoka's farm to eat one of his apples. And then they would say, this is an amazing apple. Where does this apple grow? And he says, oh, my apples don't grow on trees. Yeah, sure, they take birth there. But underneath that tree are these deep roots, and those deep roots are connected to the entire forest. So he says it takes a forest to grow a fruit, right? And that's context. So how are we going to process and cultivate and regenerate and recirculate this kind of context? And I think this is where heart intelligence comes into play. What algorithms do with big data, I think our intuitions through our heart allow us to do with deep data. Right? And so to understand this, maybe an anecdote will help. So this is one of my favorite stories. This is a guy named Julio Diaz. Julio goes, he works at a nonprofit on the East Coast of America. And every day he kind of takes the subway back. He gets off one station before to go for dinner. And one day someone comes up to him with a young kid with a knife, and he says, "Give me all your money." He says, "Okay, you have a knife." He takes out his wallet, gives him the money. And as the kid's about to go, Julio yells at him and he's like, "Hey kid, it's a little cold. You want my jacket too?" Now the kid's confused because they don't teach you this in Robbery 101, right? So he's like, "Okay, I think, yeah, it is cold. I do need a jacket. Yeah, I'll take it. Nice jacket." And he's about to go. Julio yells out again and he says, "Hey kid, I'm about to go to dinner. You want to join?" Also not what they teach you in Robbery 101. So he's like, "Okay, is this a trap? Should I go? Should I not go?" He ends up going. They have a meal, they have a nice conversation. At the end of the meal, it's time to pay the check. And Julio says, "Hey kid, I would love to treat you, but you have my wallet." And so the kid gives him back the wallet. But then Julio goes one step further. He says, "Can I have your knife too?" And the kid gives him back the knife. What's telling about that kind of heart intelligence is that you can't be a billionaire and say, "Hey, I want to scale that. Please bring 1,000 Julios in my community and let's get rid of violence." You can't have a CSR budget that does that. You can't be a head of state and sign a policy that brings that into motion. In fact, you can't even be Julio and say, "I'm going to do that every single day of my life." So the metaphor really goes from manufacturing to gardening, where you have to put in your effort, but then you rely on the grace of the sun, of the wind, of the bees. So ServiceSpace, in some sense, for the last 25 years, has been trying to cultivate this kind of context, right? Especially in a content-driven world. We started in 1999 in the heart of the Silicon Valley, and now we do lots of different things. But most recently, we've been thinking deeply about AI. How would AI look from this kind of contextual lens? But to give you some context, we started back in 1999 where the ethos of the Silicon Valley was this. This is Reid Hoffman, who is the founder of LinkedIn. And this is an actual quote from the Wall Street Journal by Reid Hoffman. He says, "Social networks do best when they tap into one of the 7 deadly sins. Facebook is ego, Zynga is sloth, LinkedIn, his own company, is greed." This is what we all use. So now the question really is, well, what about the 7 viral virtues? And who's going to design for that? And if we are going to invert the paradigm, we in ServiceSpace thought you have to change everything. You have to kind of flip the whole model. Let's be disruptive in a maximal way. So you go out and you say, "I want to create this impact in the world. For that, here is my project plan. I need this much of a budget to hire the people to implement this stuff." And then at some point, you have some inner transformation, right? This is the typical model. We flipped it. We said, what happens if you start with inner transformation? Then you'll naturally, like if you start with a small act of service, and I hope we all do this. If you start with a small act of service, immediately people will gravitate to you. As people come together, of course, they're going to do projects. They're not just going to sit there and watch TV, right? And those projects will create impact. This, I think, is a very less understood model by our modern culture. In the AI world, there's this phrase called generative AI. So we think of it as, we've kind of stumbled across generative HI, right? Generative heart intelligence. And it operates in a very simple way that even a child can understand. You start by giving with no strings attached. It could be listening to somebody, it could be opening the door, it could be paying for coffee behind you, it doesn't really matter. When you do that, there is an external ripple effect, but there's also an inner ripple effect. Something changes in you. And we often call ServiceSpace as nature funded, right? Not market funded, because nature gives you all these, like it releases endorphins and dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin for any kind act you do, even if your mind cognitively is a skeptic. So you're like, wow, I feel so great, regardless of what happens on the outside. And then what happens is it also starts to take us from the me to the we, and even the larger field beyond the we of the us. And it creates this kind of murmuration that, that Caroline talked about earlier. And then I think what you end up seeing is more service. So we often say in ServiceSpace, right, the reward for service is not that you get to be on stage. The reward for service is more service. And I think this is totally opposite of the market logic. This is love logic, right? This is what we all have received for 9 months when we were born. It's love logic with no strings attached. Now, it doesn't mean these are polar opposites, but I think it does matter what we lead with. I think we can lead with love logic, then markets will look a whole lot different if we figure out a way to do that. Here's a practical example of that. One of the projects we run now in so many places around the world is called Karma Kitchen. It's like, think of it as a pop-up. In many places, it's not a pop-up, but let's say you go over here in Stockholm, we take on a restaurant, run it by volunteers, you give food. But at the end of the meal, your check reads 0. It's 0 not because it's free, but because someone before you paid for you, and you are trusted to pay forward for people after you, right? I mean, I could give you a whole talk just on that and how powerful that is. UC Berkeley did a paper on this, and the title of that paper was Paying More When Paying for Others. It completely defies the traditional market logic. And in fact, in our audience here today, we have the founder of Vollpension in Austria, which is a cafe run by seniors. And for the last 3 months, in fact, this summer, they ran every single day. 7 days a week, they said, we're going to try to, take Vienna from the grumpiest city to the friendliest city. I think it was voted the grumpiest city. So what's happening is not magic, right? The crux of love logic is that it takes us from transaction to relationship. And we have seen where transaction takes us. It takes us to more transaction, which is extraction, which then leads to disconnection. And we have solutions to help you with that, which is, hey, please join our virtual metaverse, right? But what happens if you go in the other way, right? If you honor relationships, you create multidimensional contexts, which then connect us at the level of we in this field of deep community, and that creates a collective consciousness. A collective consciousness that is autocatalytic and figures out how to heal whatever nodes need healing. So it's not this or that person saying, I have this technique and now I shall heal you. That's a very, that may work earlier in the spectrum, but the field of consciousness is much, much more powerful than that. And I think if we tap into that, you'll arrive at compassion, right? And compassion is regenerative. So in the AI world, there's a very popular word that you'll hear everywhere called alignment. So alignment is, hey, can we have AI's goals be aligned with human goals? But what kind of human goals? It's an open question. I think a deeper question to ask is, how do we align artificial intelligence with heart intelligence? Not with market intelligence necessarily, but something a little deeper. And if you nuance this a little further, I think the question becomes, how can AI take us from content to context beyond transactions, to community, not just of people coming together for self-interest, but of noble friends, of people interested in serving others, to consciousness that heals in an organic way, to this compassion that just regenerates. So I think if we do that, we arrive at this incredible fusion between big data and deep data. We all know this. Our hearts are capable of holding so much, and that's the depth of who we are. And let's have our algorithms, help us with the big data. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I think our hearts need to lead in this endeavor. At the end of the day, I think the reason why we've all gathered here, the inner development goals, are so significant because I think we ultimately design who we are. Right? This is a photo of a murmuration. This is a whole bunch. This is a National Geographic Photo of the Year in 2019, runner-up for Photo of the Year. The photographer didn't even realize he was taking the photo until he goes home because it happened so fast. All these thousands of birds saw that there was a predator coming. They said, we need to respond. How will we respond? Let's create this shape. And then in a span of a few seconds, as soon as the predator was gone, they dissolved. Now imagine if all of us had to create this kind of shape, right? We'd be like, oh no, too much wind here on this side. I want to be at the beak. Oh, I want to be special here. I don't want to just be in the middle. Put me on the side. Where's our HR department, And yet you see this all over nature. Right? So I think as we connect with that deep compassion, right, that follows that thread from context to community to consciousness to this regenerative compassion, I think we organically start to form in these murmurations that are useful for that moment. I was at a retreat with people who were differently able. I was so inspired by what Caroline said earlier, how she spoke. I think we all were. This was a retreat with 40 people who were all differently abled, but asking the question, how can I circulate heart intelligence in the world? So people who were blind, people who were mute, people who were wheelchair bound, people who were deaf, all kinds of folks, but they all had this one question in common. So in the break, we had to take a little coffee break, and we said, okay, well, before you go to the break, a minor little tweak. We're going to blindfold everybody so we can increase our empathy for those who are blind amongst us. And so now imagine, right, all of us have blindfolds. You're like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? It was chaos. Organically, our blind brothers and sisters, there were 4 of them in the room, they said, oh, you guys don't know what you're doing. Let us lead the way. This is how you do it. And let's create a human chain. And all of a sudden, they led us with their gifts, and we created this human chain. And we got through, we had our coffee, we came back, and it was like we actually had time to spare. It was the most incredible thing to witness. It was almost like we fell into this profound murmuration because we were all organized around cultivating heart intelligence. And so I hope we can all ask that question. In India, Ram Dass has this quote. He says, in India, when you meet and greet, you say namaste. It means, I honor the place in you where the entire universe resides, where if you are in that place in you and I am in that place in me, there's only one of us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I almost want to hold your hand now.
I'll give you a hug with my cold hands.
Thank you for guiding us through our heart's intelligence. And I do wonder, though, where have you found yours?
I would say probably one of the biggest influences in my life was when my wife and I, 6 months into our marriage, decided to go on a walking pilgrimage across India. And we said we will eat wherever food is offered and sleep wherever place is offered. And to rely on the kindness of strangers in that way was very profound. But I would say the one big shift that happened for me is initially sometimes, it's like 40 degrees and sometimes people are mean and you're grumpy. And I was like, why can't the world be a bit kinder? And I think by the end of the pilgrimage, this was my inner development. by the end of the pilgrimage, I was saying, forget about the world. How can you be a bit kinder for the world? And I learned about the power of that and how it changes everything. So thank you.
Thank you so much for passing it on.